You're listening to the Born to Kick-Ass podcast with Matt Tomasi and can be found at borntokickass.com/episode 17.
Welcome to the Born to Kick-Ass podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Today's podcast is brought to you by audible.com. Get a free audiobook of your choice and a 30-day free trial by visiting borntokickass.com/audible. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. To download your free audiobook today, go to borntokickass.com/audible. Again, that's borntokickass.com/audible for your free audiobook. Do you know someone or know of someone who walks the walk and would like to hear them on the Born to Kick-Ass podcast? They can be from any field, but they need to have an inspiring story that will help to motivate others to achieve their own goals. If you do, please head over to borntokickass.com/suggest-a-guest and fill out the form. We'd love to hear from you. Alex Staniforth has achieved more than many would in a lifetime. Alex is no stranger to adversity and overcoming obstacles including epilepsy, anxiety, depression, bullying and a stammer. In 2014, Alex's first attempt at Everest was cut short when an ice avalanche killed 16 Nepalese guides in the Khumbu icefall. The following year, aged 19, Alex was caught up in an avalanche on Mount Everest just below Camp 1 during his second attempt to climb to the summit. Tragically, 3 of his teammates were killed at base camp. In this interview, Alex talks about what it was like surviving the avalanche and being trapped on the mountain. Alex is also an author and motivational speaker and offers something very unique to help others build resilience and overcome their own Everest in life. Enjoy the interview. Alex Staniforth, welcome to the Born to Kick-Ass podcast.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Now, you've got some incredible adventures under your sleeve and you're quite young. Most people your age haven't experienced what you've experienced. I'd love for you to, get into some of the adventures you've been through in your... how old are you now?
I'll be 21 next month.
Yep. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I know you've visited Everest twice, so we'll definitely get into that. But before we do, can you maybe give us a background on yourself, where you grew up, and I guess what your interests were growing up?
Sure, yeah. I mean, my backstory, it's kind of quite a miracle, really, how I ended up on Everest and doing what I'm doing now. I mean, I'll take you back to when I was 9 years old. First, even before that, I was born in Kelsall, in the northwest of England, near Chester. Started off kind of quite a normal kid, but, not really trying anything, sort of different, doing all the kind of conventional things. And when I was 9, I was then diagnosed with epilepsy, which was a pretty terrifying thing for a young person to really go through at the time. And although that was only kind of a mild form and was brought under control, and I've not had a seizure now for probably over 10 years, it actually was just the catalyst for a whole host of bigger problems, such as anxiety and panic attacks, at such a young age. I guess it left me a bit of a nervous wreck, really. I was afraid to be anywhere without my parents for the fear of having another seizure, when at that age, really, I should have just been out having fun like everybody else. So I guess that really changed things. And I guess I went from, playing sports to not doing much different than, playing on the PlayStation and doing all the sort of normal things. I've had a stammer since I've been about 3 or 4 years old, which kind of comes and goes whenever the hell it likes. It can be so bad that, at my age now, my mum still makes most of my phone calls for me, and I can sometimes not produce a single word. So with that and the anxiety, made school pretty difficult for me growing up. Like a lot of people, badly bullied at school for no real reason. Started cycling to school and having my bike tire slashed and having bottles thrown at me and being spat on. I really couldn't escape it. So all these things, meant that I didn't have a lot of confidence. I didn't really have any drive to achieve like I have now. And I think all these things, made it pretty surprising that I would go on to do what I have. I think from then on, I found the outdoors when I was 14, and that was really what sort of changed everything. That was what helped me discover my purpose and find a way to prove myself and prove all the bullies wrong, really, and just trying to find what I could overcome next, trying to do more and more and just unlock all this confidence and drive that had been kind of held away for all those years, really.
And in 2012, you summited Mont Blanc. How did that come about?
Yeah, so, from obviously finding the outdoors, it just kind of happened by chance when I was paragliding on holiday in Turkey, something that I would never have even dreamed of doing because of my confidence issues. And from then on, it kind of got into rock climbing and scuba diving and mountain biking and running and hill walking. And I remember hill walking once when I was about 14 for the first time. And I remember a simple question just popped into my head: where is Everest? And that question would kind of inspire me to go home and research and find out more. And I came across a photo that just fascinated me. It just seemed the most incredible experience and the biggest thing of all that I could overcome. And I think from then on, I decided that one day I would climb Everest, but I could never have imagined that I'd be there 4 years later. So I guess from then on, I was just sort of slowly taking steps towards making my goal a reality. So many people have their goals and don't actually put the steps in place. But I never really knew when it would happen. It was just one of those things that would happen one day. So quite a lot of stuff happened in a short time. I was nominated to run with Olympic Flame for London 2012 Olympics. So that was a massive honour that really kind of proved to me that I was doing something right, and did my first sort of fundraising events and challenges in the mountains. I guess with advice, from speaking to everybody who'd been there, just learning how to follow in their footsteps. Mont Blanc was the first sort of step towards my goal. It was my first major peak, and it's quite an achievable goal. It's quite cheap, but it is just one step of many towards being prepared for Everest. So 2012, I signed myself up for that, and that was a fantastic experience. And like everything, it just gave me more confidence and gave me a thirst to do more, really.
So when you first attempted Mont Blanc, were you sort of going into this with your mindset thinking, I'm going to use this? Did you sort of view it as you just wanted to summit that, or were you wanting to potentially use this as experience to learn from, to take the next step towards Everest?
I think it was definitely focused on Everest. That was pretty much why I signed myself up. But at the same time, it was still a very good experience. I was just kind of hungry for more challenges and to sort of find what I could do next, really. It just felt like a progression. But definitely the original idea came from, asking somebody for advice and, doing what they did. And they kind of went from a background of all the UK hill walking and winter climbing that I'd done and rock climbing to go on to use that to aim higher. And Mont Blanc was a pragmatic step up, really. But it wasn't like my success was, dependent on me reaching the top of Mont Blanc, but I certainly wanted the buzz of the challenge. And at the time it was a massive thing for me, really.
Now, when you, I guess, came back from that, how long after did you start to really toy with the idea that you're actually going to give Everest a go? Like, when did you sort of mentally commit that that you're going to start the ball rolling on your Everest adventure?
It's a bit of a weird story. Let me think, because so much has happened in a short time. I think at the same time, I was running for a club. I was competing in half marathon and 5K and 10K events, and I was actually meant to be doing one for them tomorrow, but I dropped a laptop on my foot yesterday, and now it's black.
Yeah, the laptop pull up.
Yeah, that's
break?
the excuse. It's not broken, I don't think. It's just I can't really walk on it. So that's one excuse I've not used before. So I was running quite seriously and training 6 days a week. And I did mention earlier that at school I also hated sport. I wasn't one of those who was really into football or really sporty. I was hopeless at sport, and well, probably still am. And I remember coming second to last in the cross country race in the sports at school. Pretty far cry from where I am now, but back then I just hated the idea of exercise. But at this time, I found the sport and I just love entering races and competing. And at the time, that was actually a bigger goal to me, than Everest. I was trying to get really at the top of my game there. But then I picked up an injury, which would then go on to put me out for, not far off a year and a half. And it would progress and get worse and worse, that eventually I couldn't run, I couldn't cycle, I couldn't do any of the outdoor things that I enjoyed doing. And so I'd sort of lost my passion and lost my purpose all over again. I was back to where I started. Now, that was the same year that I had the Olympic Torch. That was the same year I had the Mont Blanc and all the charity fundraising that I did around that. So I was kept pretty busy. But it was when all that stuff kind of settled down. That was when it kind of hit me. I'm still not running. I've lost my escape here. And the frustration, of being injured. And then the athlete will know just how frustrating it is when you can't run. I think wore me down over a long period of time. And I've always been prone to mental health problems because of my anxiety and my epilepsy and the bullying and things. But that gave me my first bad proper bout of anxiety and depression. And I was in a pretty difficult place for a long time. I think when the year had gone quiet. So I think it was towards the winter of that year that I was just in a really hopeless and, kind of a hopeless and sort of spiraling place. And it was just getting worse and worse. And I couldn't really see a way out. And I realized I needed a new focus. I needed something to kind of get me back on my feet again. I had to do something. And at the same time, I read the book by Bear Grylls and the story of how he broke his back just 18 months before he climbed Everest. And that for me was just transformational. It was like, if he can climb that, if he can overcome that first, then I can overcome this. And that for me was what kind of gave me the glimmer of hope that I needed. So by this point, I've been speaking to lots of Everest climbers, basically for everything I didn't know, I found something. I found something or someone who did. It was a case of just asking questions and learning and learning and learning. And by this point, I got a good idea, a good picture in my mind of how to get there, the sort of things I needed to do first and how much time it would take, how much it would cost. I remember one night sitting there at home and seeing a photo of Everest. And I just remember this feeling just rushing over me. And pretty much there and then, I decided that 2014 would be the year that I'd climb Everest. As you do. So that basically, for me, gave me something to get myself out of bed every morning, gave me a new goal and something to work towards. And that was just what I needed. But of course, you got the risk, that gave me just 18 months to actually fundraise and put it all in place. And also, I didn't know if I'd ever train again, let alone train to climb the world's highest mountain. But I think something just told me it was the right thing to do. And it went from there, really.
And what did your parents think? Like you were, 17 at the time when you sort of committed?
Yeah, 17. I had the idea of doing it then. And of course, 2014, I think the law for me was that I would have been the youngest Brit to climb via the South Ridge. Not in general, but via the South Ridge. It's a pretty loose record, but with sponsorship, you just got to find anything you can. I think that was what kind of gave me the kind of time pressure of it. Because a lot of people, they want to climb Everest and it just sits on the back burner and then life gets in the way. And then they get to kind of 40, 50, then they quit the jobs. And, I didn't want to get to that point. I wanted to do it while I had the chance. So my parents at the time, I remember, I think it was a case of, oh, that's nice, dear, sort of thing. And that's a lot of money to spend on a holiday. I mean, if Everest is a holiday, I want my money back. um, I think, of course, every parent's going to be apprehensive, and I think there was some reservation that I'd even get there. To raise over £35,000 on my own with a pretty standard background. My parents weren't just going to slip me a check, like some Everest climbers, have had that privilege because their parents are obviously quite affluent. I kind of had quite a normal background and I've had to kind of get there off my own back. And at the same time, I was washing pots in my local pub every weekend. I mean, that wasn't going to pay for the trip. So I think there was a bit of doubt I'd get there, and of course hesitation, and sort of telling me that I should focus on my studies and my A-levels first. But I kind of promised them that I would manage both. And sure enough, I just managed to scrape the A-level grades that I needed. And Everest then became my full-time job once I finished school. I put everything else on the back burner. Everest was like the gap year. It never really ended. And I think, of course, there's the risk of it. There's a danger, and every parent worries. But they're incredibly proud. And I think now they've seen me actually get there. It's I think it surprised them. And I'm just really fortunate to have their support, really.
Now, before we actually get into the first Everest attempt, can you maybe give us a overview of the sponsorship? How did you approach the sponsorship side of things? Were you just reaching out to various companies and organisations to try and get sponsors on board?
I mean, I write a lot about it in the book because it's just so complex, and it was just really a case of a shy bear gets no sweets, trying to learn and ask as much as I could. I mean, it's a long process. It's a numbers game, and there's so much to it. I think in general, it's a case of trying to stand out. It's trying to see yourself as a brand. It's not begging because it's marketing. People sponsor you in return for brand promotion and CSR and advertising. It's not just about, tweets and logos and things. To begin with, I got help of mentors and coaches and, just trying to learn off people who understood the business world, because I had absolutely no idea. I hadn't really, no sort of strategy. I just put together a sponsorship pitch and tried to make myself stand out, tried to focus on my strengths, which I guess was adversity. There's lots of people who want to climb Everest, but it's trying to stand out really and trying to prove to young people what they're capable of. So I guess once I had the pitch, it was simply a case of emailing businesses day in and day out, week after week for a full year, knowing all along that, I may not get there, but you have to just give it 100%. It has to become your full-time job. So I wasn't too selective on the businesses. I kind of refined my approach. I learned as I went along and saw what was working. And you don't really want to go towards the big companies like your HSBC or your Shell Oil, because you want, they're just too big, because sponsorship marketing is pretty finicky and there's obviously a lot of risk involved. So it's a case of choosing the right sort of businesses. And then it's a case of, as I said, it's a numbers game. It's contacting a large number over a long period of time, and persistence and, persistence and resilience, and just complete effort, really.
So just don't give up, just keep at them, and then hopefully it'll pay off.
It does. It's one of those where you may not get anything for months and months, and then you can get 4 in a week. And 4 weeks before the trip, I had £8,000 still to raise. But there was something all along that sort of told me I was going to get there. But it has to be a full-time job. You can't do it half-heartedly, because there's so many people trying to compete for it. But what really made the difference to me, I think, was just knowledge. It wasn't really what I knew, but it was kind of who I knew. It was the people around me that really made the difference.
And can you give us an idea of the cost for the license to I believe you need a license to, or actually like a permit?
A permit. Yeah, there is a permit. I mean, if you go obviously from the Nepal side or the Chinese side, there's a permit which you have to apply for. On the Nepal side, currently it's about $11,000 US. And to be honest, I'm not sure how much it is on the Chinese side, but I think it's not far off the same, if not a little bit less.
Now, 2014, can you tell us about attempt at Everest? So,
yeah, I was 18 and got out there and felt confident, felt strong. It was all going to plan. And, it was finally happening, really. It was an incredible feeling to get there. I was on a team led by a British guide, and there was 4 of us, and we were sharing base camp with some other teams. We have a 3-week walk to base camp. So we set off at the end of March. We're there for 2 months. And all was going really well until a day before we get to base camp. And then, of course, there's a major avalanche in the icefall, which killed 16 climbing Sherpas in just a tragic accident. And it was a case of them being in the worst place at the worst time. Now, what happened then was quite a complex story of politics and all sorts of stuff. It turned pretty nasty. It wasn't a Sherpa strike, as was heard in the press. Very few sources have actually quoted that. And again, I write a lot more about it in the book because it was a pretty long, complex story. But in essence, it was a small number of Sherpas trying to get their demands off the Ministry of Tourism. And the only way they could do that was to effectively cancel the climbing season by turning all the Sherpas against us. Well, not so much against us, trying to intimidate them and stop them climbing, so that it would effectively stop us climbing because we need their support. And they were basically put under threat that if they climbed, they would get hurt, and we can't risk the Sherpas being hurt. For our climb. So basically, they'd held the whole mountain on ransom. It was a real sad and nasty situation. So basically, after a week of not knowing what was going to happen, we had to head home. We soon realised nothing was going to improve, and a small number had effectively won. They bit the hand that fed them. So we then obviously walked out of base camp 5 weeks early, having not actually stepped foot above Everest Base Camp. After all that. So yeah, it didn't go particularly well.
To actually get to base camp, how do you get there? Do you need to trek into base camp, or how do you get to actual base camp?
Well, on the north side, there's a road most of the way, and you go in by jeep. There's very little walking, and of course, you don't just drive from Kathmandu to there because of the height jump. You kind of, you're still acclimatized in the same way. And then on the Nepal side, you walk in from Lukla normally, which is, well, it can be 10 days. Some of the expeditions, the budget operators will kind of do a short trek to save money, but the more time, the better, because it gives your body more gradual time to acclimatize. There's no point arriving at base camp, being sat there with a headache. So it's nice and slow and easy. It's not meant to be strenuous, and we just take our time. We stay in the villages with friends and see some amazing places. We tend to go over about 3 weeks and go off the kind of, we tend to go more off the beaten track, which is, it's a stunning part of the world, really.
Can you actually train for the altitude, back in England or just anywhere? Is that something physiological where, I've heard some people, it doesn't matter how fit they are. Some people will get altitude sickness regardless of whether they're super fit or not.
Yeah, I don't personally believe that you can. I think, there are things like oxygen chambers and oxygen kind of gear where you can sample, where you can sample, where you can train on a hypoxic generator. So effectively, you're sort of simulating the conditions at altitude. But I think personally, I don't think that you can actually train for altitude other than, going to expeditions beforehand. That's why we're obviously walking over a long time, and that's why we spend so much time on the mountain to obviously, to obviously get our bodies, as best as we can. But I think I found, I'd done lots of endurance cycling and interval stuff, and quite high intensity stuff, some strength training just to build my general conditioning and endurance, lots of long walks and climbing. But I would break Everest into kind of 3 areas. There's mental, physical, and skills. And I think the skills obviously comes from prior expeditions, prior climbing, so that things become natural to you. Because on Everest, something like a drop glove can be a life or death situation. I think mental is probably the most important, and again, that just comes from experience through your training and through your prior expeditions. Because some would say that Everest is 90% mental, 10% physical, but of course, it makes sense to get yourself in the best physical shape that you can to give yourself the best chance. But I think on my expedition, I was the fittest. Probably by a long way in terms of my training. but I struggle more than anybody. You know, I was having a really hard time. Some people say that age doesn't actually help you at altitude. You know, it's better to be older. Young people can struggle more. But I've always found I've struggled at altitude more than many. There was a guy on my team last year who was 60 who just had a heart bypass, and he was cading it past me, which is a bit, which just proves, you know, to show that fitness obviously helps, but I don't think it really makes a difference when it comes to altitude sickness. It can improve your performance, it can improve your mental resilience, but I don't believe in all these hypoxic things. I really just don't think it helps. I think it's a case of mental resilience is the most key thing.
Now, after coming back after that first tragic event where, you know, the 16 Sherpas were killed in that avalanche, you came back home. What was life like for you then? Did you want to sort of double down and reattempt Everest? What were you sort of doing around that time, you know, after coming back from the first attempt?
Well, it was a major shock, you know. I mean, after all that work, you don't expect something like that will happen and stop you. So, you know, it's such a kind of almost a silly situation of politics, really. And of course, I mean, you know, first and foremost, it was just to be there and miss such a massive tragedy where 16 people have lost their lives. It was just it was a shock, really. I guess, you know, admittedly, I was quite sort of bitter about the situation, and of course, you know, not because of the tragedy, but the fact that a few people had taken that tragedy to stop us climbing, to try and achieve their own means. But, you know, it is what it is. And at the time, I was quite frustrated. I was quite resentful about, you know, I almost felt like I'd put all this hard work in and just, you know, I'd been kicked in the teeth. But what matters is how we respond to the kick, and every obstacle is an opportunity in disguise. So, to begin with, I came back from Kathmandu a little bit lost, a little bit embarrassed, really. And I also got salmonella, which made things even worse. So I was stuck in bed for 2 weeks. And I think quite quickly, I sort of started to change my approach and started to think ahead. And I think I realized that, you know, straight away I was going to have to go back. I wasn't going to let something like that stop me. But I was going to sort of change the approach. I knew straight away that I was going to have to raise most of the money all over again, you know, start from scratch. And that was quite daunting. And I thought, well, how on earth am I going to get sponsors to put money in again after what's just happened? Because, of course, my sponsors had lost out a lot of the exposure that they would have got. And I felt quite embarrassed for them, really. I felt bad that something had happened, even though it wasn't my fault. I still felt a sense of guilt. So I thought, okay, how am I going to get sponsors on board again? And at the same time, I saw it as a positive. I saw it as a chance to train and get myself even more prepared for the next attempt. So that was where the Epic 7 plans kind of came together. I think that originally actually came from an email from my personal, my personal, you know, that, sorry, I'll start again. I think that actually came from an email from my personal trainer who said that I should focus on a challenge where you haven't got the objective factors like Everest or high altitude mountaineering, when there's weather or avalanches or politics or so much stuff that can go wrong, to try and do a challenge where the only thing that can let me down is myself, which I thought was a great idea. So I always tend to try and aim too high and do too much. So I came up with the idea of the Epic 7, and I guess it grew from there, really.
And what is the Epic 7? Is there 7 sort of challenges that you came up with?
That was the plan. I mean, yeah. In the end, there's actually 6. Of course, Everest was the 7th. That was my kind of holy grail. But these challenges, I guess the aim was, I think, was to kind of give me the buzz of achievement and the thrill of achieving a goal, like I had on Mont Blanc, and I'd missed out on Everest. I'd missed out on Bruntsea and Mera Peak, which is my training expedition before Everest, because I didn't summit that either. So it was kind of give me the buzz of it, because that's why we do it. I mean, I know we can't always aim to reach the top, you know, that's mountaineering, but I kind of miss that sense of achievement. So it's a case of doing things where they were low budget. So obviously they didn't take too much money away from Everest. They were easy to organise, because I was going to be organising them over a short period of maybe a year or so. And fundraising for the Sherpas who died in the avalanche through the Himalayan Trust. So that was important for me as well. It felt, that after such an event, they really needed our help. And I think it wasn't just my personal kind of, experience and to kind of get more training behind me. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that I wish I'd done beforehand, ultra endurance stuff that would play a part in the challenges, but it was also to kind of build some momentum and to give my sponsors some kind of more coverage. For example, rather than them just like sponsoring one trip that could go wrong, they're going to get advertised and endorsed through all the challenges. So the aim of that was, of course, give them, continuous exposure. Now, I'm not a businessman. I'm not good of ideas, but the Epic 7 is probably the only idea that I'm actually proud of because it served that purpose. It brought my head sponsor on board pretty much straight away.
And can you list out what those Epic 7 challenges were? You've got them listed out on your website, which is alexstaniforth.com, but are you able to maybe just tell us what each of the 7 are? Each of the 6 plus...
Yes. Yeah. Well, so basically it was, it was mostly on the bike or in the mountains because, after my injury, I didn't run for over 3 years because of the injury risk and the cost of the expeditions. It was just too much of a risk. So it was mostly cycling, or combining the two. So again, it was a fine balance of wanting to do stuff that would really push me outside my comfort zone, where we learn and we grow the most, but not being too hard that I failed or injure myself because then it defeats the object. So the first challenge was the Fred Whitton, which was the toughest cycling sportive in the UK. I've actually done that a few times since, and at the time it was big, but of course, as I do more and more, these things become smaller and smaller. That involves 120 miles in the Lake District, cycling up all the high passes in one day. So you've got about 12,000 foot of climbing over that day. Normally that's an organised event, but I literally just packed a bag full of snacks, headed out on my own and just went on a long ride really. And this, each one went with some sort of drama, I think I took a wrong turn at one point and ended up having to race 12 miles back in, I think, a really short time, and literally got to the station about a minute and a half before the final train came. And then I got threatened by some nutcase in the train station and had to run off down the street at 2 a.m. and hide behind a hotel to then call a taxi. It's just stuff like that really that kind of, it's where what matters is how you respond to it. Yeah. So the second challenge was the Welsh 3000s, which is walking the 14 highest mountains in Wales over 3,000 feet high in less than 24 hours. So that was, again, on my own. 32 miles of walking, about 12,000 feet of climbing, and of course 14 mountains of course in this time limit. That was quite tough at the time. It took me 18 and a half hours non-stop. Number 3 was cycling from Chester to Chamonix in the French Alps. So 880 miles in 8 days, unsupported mostly, on my own pretty much the entire time, borrowing a few miles with one of my friends, and not really having a clue what I was doing. I mean, if you've seen the film Mr. Bean's Holiday, this was the sequel. I mean, everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. This one really pushed me. And of course, I'm cycling, basically a sportive every day. I'm doing 100 miles plus most days, and all sorts happened. I mean, from crashes to being so tired that I managed to literally keep falling asleep on the bike, literally just falling asleep and waking up in grass in the side of the road.
Just crashing?
Just constantly falling off because I was so tired, because I barely slept. Then there's things like, cycling 140 miles one day to then get to the hotel at 2 a.m. and all I can have for dinner is a Snickers bar. I mean, it's stuff like that really. On the final night, managed to get to the point of being so tired I was hallucinating and seeing like signs warning me of unexploded mines in the area, which is in like It's kind of a residential street in the middle of France, pretty surreal. And it shows you, what the mind can do when you're so exhausted.
Yeah.
And kind of falling off the bike again and being lying there in the tarmac with my leg bleeding, just sobbing my heart out, just with nothing left to give. But I'm on my own in this dark road in a forest in the middle of nowhere at like 1 a.m, and there's nobody to help me. I ran out of food, I ran out of water, I ran out of phone battery. All I can do is peel myself off the ground. The only person who can fail is myself. And that was the aim of the Epic 7. It's having ownership of the outcome, that nothing can stop me other than myself. So anyway, that was probably the most epic of all of them. When I got there, I then climbed the highest peak in Switzerland, the Dom de Mischabel, which is the greatest vertical ascent in the Alps. So you've pretty much got 2 miles of vertical up and 2 miles of vertical down in a day and a half. I couldn't walk for about a week after that. The fifth challenge was a twist on one of the early challenges I did called the Three Peaks Challenge. So it's the 3 highest mountains in Britain. But normally it's done in 24 hours driving in between them. Ben Nevis, Snowdon and Scafell Pike. So I did it on my bike and basically cycled in between them. So again, completely on my own, 440 miles of cycling in 4 days and walking these mountains in between. It was in the middle of winter. It was dark. It was wet. It was cold. And on the first day, I remember going into a pothole, going over the handlebars and knocking myself out. And at that point, it was like, wanting to just to throw the towel in. But it's a case of calming down, of refocusing on the goal. And as a job, I preach to people about fears and, about hitting the fears head on. And here I was having to test my own fear. The next day, I think I had something like 5 or 6 punches. And I remember, running out of inner tubes and all sorts of things and tires in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. And again, it's just a case of getting back on the bike and keeping on pushing. The 6th challenge was actually not epic at all. And to be honest, I'm quite embarrassed talking about it. There was a trail in Scotland called the Great Glen Way, which goes from Fort William to Inverness. So normally that's done in sort of 5 or 6 days, 79 miles. So I did it in 2.5 days on my own. Pretty unepic, really. But to be honest, that was only a month before the expedition. And to then, to push it and injure myself before the trip would not have been epic at all. But all these things gave me such great preparation that brought me all the way to Everest at the end of March last year.
Yeah, this takes a lot of courage to do all those things, especially at that age. And then the 7th challenge was the Everest attempt in 2015.
Yeah.
Can you? Yeah, and I believe this is what your book is about as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, Everest last year certainly was epic, but all for the wrong reasons. So yeah, Icefall, my book. I mean, it's titled as such because, of course, as many people may know, the Icefall is the first section of the climb just above base camp before you get to Camp 1.
This is the Khumbu Icefall?
Yes, that's right. It's a glacier, so it's constantly moving. You've got the towers of ice that can fall on you, and then you've got the cracks in the ground and the ropes in the ladders, and some of these openings are 200, 300 foot deep. It's a pretty treacherous place to be. But back to Everest, I mean, sometimes I've learned that plan B can become plan A all along, and I think I found myself in a completely different position mentally and physically. And last year, it just felt like this year was really going to happen. I was 19, I'd got sponsors on board so much easier, which was originally my fear. And Westgrove are still, they were involved in the early days and are still involved with me now, and they will be involved with my next expeditions as well, which in some ways wouldn't have happened if I hadn't gone back to Everest. Sometimes these things can lead to much bigger things. So this time we started walking into base camp. I was on the same team, same people around me, same format, just a year stronger. And then we got to base camp and everything was fine. It was quite emotional being back there, especially what had happened the year earlier. and that was in the back of our minds. And then we actually started to make progress on the mountain. I mean, Everest is climbed in acclimatization rotation. So, you make a number of trips up the mountain, going a little bit higher each time to adjust to the altitude and to wait for the conditions to be right. That's why we're there for such a long time. Probably 5 weeks in total at base camp if it's a long season. So, and well, I'm sure you also heard of the Nepal earthquake that struck around this time last year. Well, we happened to be heading up on our first rotation that day. We were going to Camp 1 for the first time, and then we stayed there for a night, then go to Camp 2 the following day, stay there, and come back to base camp.
Yeah.
Well, that day we're moving through the icefall, and it was one of those days where I just had a really tough time. I mean, altitude's like a horse race, and you have good and bad days for no real reason. It's not so much about being breathless, it's more a general pain and discomfort that you can't really pinpoint. You don't really know where it hurts. You just have to get your head down and focused on one step at a time. So that day, we left base camp about 5 a.m. with heavy bags on, carrying gear and supplies up through the icefall. And that's why we leave early, because the ice is more stable when it's colder in the morning. So I've been walking for maybe 5 or 6 hours. I was over the worst of it. I was over the more technical sections, moving on these big open ice blocks. Most of my team had raced ahead, leaving just me on my own. 2 guys a bit behind me, 2 guys probably 20 minutes ahead. So I'm absolutely knackered. I'm just exhausted, got my head down, focusing one step, focusing on arriving at camp for a rest, and just pulling on the rope step after step, just trying to ignore the pain, really. And of course, that's when the earthquake strikes. But I was so tired that I didn't actually feel the ground shaking. I didn't actually feel the earthquake. I just remember hearing this massive cracking sound above my head, just echoing through the valley. I mean, by this point, I was probably half an hour below Camp 1 in the Western Coombe, this massive valley. It's otherworldly. And this noise just split the silence. And I know, of course, that's the sound of ice breaking off the mountain. And I look up and, well, I think, oh no, I'm in trouble. I mean, I said something a bit worse at the time, but I better not say that on air. I know I need to get out there quickly because, of course, this is the sound of ice. And then behind that is a distant rumble of an avalanche coming at me from above. I think, okay, I'm near where the guys died the year earlier and I need to move pretty quickly. But you can't run and you can't hide at altitude, especially not in the Western Coombe. You've got these massive drops and obstacles all around you. All you can do is move as fast as you can and hope that you get out of the way in time.
Can I just ask about the ice cracking? I'm guessing you'd hear the sounds of ice, maybe like in the Khumbu ice falls, cracking all the time. When you heard this particular ice crack, was it completely different to the other sounds of the mountain sort of moving and creaking and groaning? Was it like a distinct, this is something different?
I think I was so tired that nothing really sank in that well. I mean, when you're at base camp, you hear avalanches all the time. Not always in the icefall, there's peaks all around you. You're in this massive mountain amphitheater. And, you hear these things and most people don't really bat an eyelid. The day before we went up, there was a massive avalanche coming down the Lola Pass at the end of base camp. In the icefall itself, I never really noticed a lot of cracking. You don't really, people say that you hear these things cracking and moaning at you as if they're going to fall on you. I never experienced that, although I only went in the icefall twice. But this crack, I think this one worried me more because I knew I was under it. I knew where I was. I knew that I had the west shoulder of Everest on my left-hand side, which is where the avalanche fell in 2014. And I know that I'm now vulnerable, whereas at base camp, you're kind of safe. So I think I just remember it kind of booming around the whole valley. It was a different sound. And at the time, I wasn't thinking I was going to die. I was thinking, okay, this is not good. I was quite nervous. But it's such a large place and there's so many avalanches everywhere that you don't really tend to think that they're going to get you. But I do remember my heart pounding through to the floor and suddenly feeling more energy than I felt all day, just from the adrenaline and the panic of thinking that I need to move. But whether it was a different sound, I don't know. But when you hear this kind of distant roar, I mean, it's like a big primal scream, like an express train, and it's getting faster and louder all the time. I think, to be honest, it's all very, very vague to me now. But I definitely knew I was in trouble. I do recall that feeling.
And that sound of the avalanche, was that was heading towards you? Or could you tell what sort of direction the avalanche or the sound was coming from?
Well, that was it. I mean, the thing is that day was a pretty horrible day. It was cloudy. There was, there was fresh snowfall. It was windy. It was quite turbulent. There was a thick fog in the valley, and the visibility was going as low as 10 meters to maybe a little bit further. So I couldn't see camp at all. And I could just make out the bottom of the cliffs of the west shoulder of Everest, but it was intermittent. It was going from a few meters to more, so I could hear it all the time. And it's more scary when you know you're under something that could be avalanching. But I couldn't work out where it's coming from. And considering where I was standing under this giant cliff, and you see the photos, I think actually I'm probably glad I couldn't see it, because I think if I'd seen it coming at me in the scale that it was, I think I would have. It would have made it even more terrifying. But I recall that after every sort of few steps on the rope, I'd kind of unclip and I'd just sort of stop and look to my left, just trying to picture where it was going to come from, and obviously not being able to see anything. I was on my own, so I couldn't even ask or, speak to anybody about it. It was just my own interpretation. And then I think it was maybe a minute or so, and I started to relax. I started to think, okay, it should have hit me by now. Maybe I've escaped. Phew, that was close. And then I remember sort of stopping to catch my breath, and then not really wanting to stop because I didn't know if I was still in danger. And then it just hits me with this whack, like a snow cannon just unleashed in my face, and just like throws me onto my knees, and I fall over, and there's this deafening blast coming through, like a force I've never felt. I can't hear anything but this in my ears. I can't breathe from the snow going down my throat and up my nose and down my clothes, and I'm just having to turn my head away to try and gasp for air, but the air is so cold it kind of takes my breath away. I'm sort of suffocating almost. And then around me, all I can see is this sort of deathly white as I kind of put my head down and try and turn away. And for the first time in my life, I just think, this is it. So this is how I die at 19. And that's just the most sickening feeling of pure fear, pure fear like I could never describe, that any second now, ice is just going to follow and it's all going to go black. I'm going to be buried, never to be found. I think of the people who died the year earlier. Some of them still haven't been found. I think of everybody back home. I think what I've done to them. And just pure helplessness. There's nothing I can do but just stand and take it.
Yeah.
And it just keeps coming, and I just wonder when it's going to end. And it's like the longest panic attack of my life. So I started to punch and kick and swim, kind of dad dancing halfway up Everest, thinking that there's a better chance of survival, of creating an airspace around my face. You kind of go into survival mode. And then I think I'm kind of trying to fight Mother Nature, and then it just stops. The snow just falls to the ground. The mountain just falls dead silent. And then I think, well, I'm still here, Yeah. It still sends the hairs up on my arms now, to be honest.
Could you believe that it had stopped, or were you you would have been in such a state of shock that you wouldn't know what's going on?
Well, I think it was shock, to be honest. I can't really remember much about it, but I think I was just amazed that I was now an avalanche survivor. I think I was amazed that I'd just been in what I had, that I'd actually made it out. I think I don't so much sense any relief, or kind of a relief that it stopped. I was just stunned, utterly stunned. And I didn't waste a second. I just shot off to camp as soon as I could. And the ropes are buried under snow, and my heart stops. And then I just obviously give him a sharp pull, and they come straight out of the snow. So I remember having my head down and just pushing on as fast as I could, thinking that more avalanches could follow. I assume my team behind me are dead, but there's nothing I can do to help them. I get on the radio, I'm calling ahead, saying, help, we've been avalanche, send for help, over, we've been avalanche, and there's no response. And I repeat again, and there's no response. And I start crying and swearing into the radio, and there's no response. That was when I heard my team talking to each other. So for some reason, mine wouldn't connect. But I could hear they were alive. And the relief then was just unbelievable.
Yeah.
And then I came across 2 guys in my team. These were a lot tougher than me, a lot more experienced, a lot older, kind of hugging each other. And, they looked close to tears, and their glasses shattered by the force of this blast. We all thought each other had died. I mean, I've never seen men in such a state. And I think then 2 guys from the team who were already at camp had come down on a short rope to try and find us. However, I didn't realise at the time that they were on a search mission for the 2 guys that I found, David and Aeneas. They'd already agreed as leaders at camp that I was so far behind the others that day that I either wouldn't have survived or wouldn't survive the night. So they weren't even looking for me, and that's quite hard to take, really. They were surprised to see me alive.
Yeah, that would have been full on.
Yeah.
So what sort of happened then? You were positioned a little bit before Camp 1. Was this where it all happened?
Well, because our first fears were that Camp 1 was going to be destroyed. I mean, it wasn't... Well, the thing is, it wasn't a typical avalanche. It was a big blast of powder, a powder avalanche as such, and if that even exists. I mean, in other words, we'd escaped the ice, and I think the hanging Serac, which had fallen the year earlier and caused all the damage and the death, hadn't fallen, or if it had fallen in a different place. So we just kind of got the displaced snow. But believe me, when one of those things is coming at you, you don't know what's in it. You don't know how big it is. You don't know what's going to happen. You're just waiting. So we'd had a pretty lucky escape, really. It was pretty harmless. But because of the fog, we then, I think I recall, before the other 2 guys came down on the rope, we carried on, the 3 of us, to the base of camp where the ropes had then disappeared. And of course, it's a glacier, there's crevasses everywhere. And of course, if there's no rope, there's of course, there's risk of falling into them. So I remember staying there, and that was when the guys came down on the short rope and guided us up safely back to camp. But the first tents we could see were just flattened, and then all the climbers were unhurt. But they're all trying to kind of dig out the tents and salvage things, and apparently their cook was missing. And that was when we all sort of looked at each other and thought, okay, this is bad. We're going to be pulling people out of the snow here. And I remember my friend handing me Jelly Baby just to try and stop the shock setting in, which actually made a big difference. But then, kind of towed in a line, we kind of arrived at camp, and more tents started appearing, and it just seemed that this first team had the worst of it. The rest of camp they'd been powdered as well.
So sorry, can I just ask, when you say camp, are you talking about Camp 1 or the base camp?
Camp 1.
Okay.
No, Camp 1. Yeah, I mean, we were well ahead of base camp.
Okay.
It seems that this first kind of row of tents had the worst had the worst blast. I mean, everybody at Camp 1 and Camp 2 had been blasted by this powder, and obviously thought it was a major avalanche. But all the tents were intact, and everybody was up there shocked, but obviously pleased to see us. So I guess that was when it all unfolded. I mean, at the time, we had no idea that base camp had been hit by an even bigger avalanche triggered by the earthquake. People got, mixed up and thought it was the same one that got us and came down the icefall, but it didn't at all. The avalanche that hit base camp came from the very opposite side, from Pomori and Lingtron, and was obviously full of, it was a Serac fall. It was full of ice, full of rock, and that was what did the damage. So at the time, I didn't actually know there'd been an earthquake until somebody in my tent mentioned it. I just thought it was an isolated avalanche. So I think, it's all a blur to me now, but I still recall one of the leaders getting on the radio and ringing down to base camp and asking if everything was okay there, and the kind of obvious relief on the radio that we were okay, because when there's an avalanche or not an earthquake, people assume that the people on the mountain are going to be worse off. They panicked more about us. But that was when I remember hearing him saying, it's chaos, it's destruction, everything's gone. And sort of hearing the panic in his voice. And we were just stunned. We're like, how can base camp be gone? What on earth is going on? And all sorts of pictures kind of taunting our mind, really. It was just like a nightmare. And from then on, I was so shocked and so ill from it all that I just remember lying in my tent for 2 days. We're told we could be there for a week. We've only got supplies for the one night. So I guess as a team, we're stuck at Camp 1. The route to base camp has been wiped out pretty much, or so we think. And we just have to make the best of the situation, knowing that base camp, something really bad's happened. The day later, we then hear on the radio that 3 of our staff have died. And that just has everybody in tears. Everybody was just working out what on earth had happened. And then every half an hour or so, you've got more aftershocks from the earthquake, causing more avalanches coming down at us on both sides. We just sat there like ducks in a pond, really. It was utterly crazy, just wondering if and when we were going to get out of there.
Yeah, that would have been just so hard to take. Firstly, you've survived the avalanche, and then not only that, you've managed to hook up and meet up with other survivors, and then it's like, now what? The potential path back down to base camp is potentially gone. What were you sort of thinking? Were you sort of thinking, I'm going to die at Camp 1? Were you sort of thinking that?
I didn't feel, I think I was so out of it that I'd never actually felt kind of vulnerable after that. I think mentally, when you've already been so close to something, and even though it was harmless, at the time, I didn't think that at all. I think at the time I'd been so close to it that I kind of stopped being scared of it, if you know what I mean. I think once you've been scared that much, you kind of lose the ability, you kind of lose your kind of fear for a while almost. And I think I never really felt vulnerable after that. I was so in shock that I was just like a vegetable for 2 days. I kind of didn't really think about anything. I just lay there, just a bit in shock. I think everybody in the team responded differently. Some were panicking, some were more worried about stuff, but I was so out of it that I just remember lying there, not really caring what happened.
What's the sort of altitude at Camp 1?
Camp 1 is just over 6,000 meters, so you're higher than the top of Kilimanjaro. So it's pretty difficult, and I know, of course, it's quite low. I've been over 6,500 meters, and that's a different ball game. But just trying to stay hydrated is a massive challenge. And simply to have the energy to melt snow and lean over to turn the stove on, it just takes such a massive effort. And I'd almost kind of gave up caring about myself. I didn't force the food down. I didn't drink. And at altitude, that is what stops you becoming seriously ill. Hydration is incredibly important. And, being at altitude for 2 days, it was pretty difficult. Especially without enough water. No matter how much you drink, you feel absolutely shattered. And I barely left my tent, really. Our teams kind of stayed together and kept the spirits up. We're just basically waiting for news. I had my satellite phone. I was able to ring home. And at the time, none of it really sunk in. I didn't really care what happened, to be honest. I was just out of it. That's the only way I can describe it. But I was just kind of grateful, really, that we weren't any higher. We did originally talk about going to Camp 2 because it's not that far away and it's less exposed to the avalanches from the side of the mountain. But it's the altitude jump when I was ill, and there's also the risk of more, of moving up where the ropes may have been pulled out. There's the risk of that. It was decided that the safest bet was to stay where we were, and basically just wait for a way to kind of get out of there. But I do remember one of the leaders mentioning that we may have to go through the icefall in the dark, whilst it's more stable to get down. But then two of the leaders, Damien Vegas and Rolf Ustra, went down to try and fix the route. And one of the aftershocks, well, there was a massive aftershock the day after on the Sunday that basically had the whole kind of floor just bouncing and bouncing around, and somebody shouting, get in the tents, as we just kind of waited for this thing just to flatten us. And those guys had been in the icefall, and basically the avalanche had just, that had basically wiped out all their efforts. And I think that was when we realised that taking people down back through the icefall just wasn't an option. And helicopter was the option that got us down 2 days later.
That's unbelievable. So what were you thinking when you first actually saw the helicopter coming? Like, you heard the chopper, a day later. Was this still a surreal moment?
There was talk of the helicopters coming on the day after, on the Sunday. I mean, some people got out of there pretty quickly, but there was definitely a relief. But knowing that we didn't know what we were coming down to, and I guess that was that hesitation. And by this point, because of being in the altitude and the combination of shock, not drinking or eating enough, I had to force the food down, and force the water down. But but you just can't get enough down you. I was absolutely wrecked, and I remember being told that the helicopter would come at, I think it was 6:30. It was really early in the morning. I remember being woken up by my tent mate and told we had half an hour to pack. And it just takes so much effort to do that. And then being kind of hurried out of the tent and just sort of told to walk to the helipad. And it must have been maybe 200 meters distance to walk there with my rucksack to wait for the helicopter. There was kind of 2 helipads which we kind of made up. And obviously this has been coordinated by radio with base camp. The first helicopter didn't arrive till the following day, and the first worry was whether they would even turn up for us. If they were in Kathmandu, had they been damaged, would they needed elsewhere? They were obviously much more important in the main towns and places. But they did turn up, and I remember walking to the helipad, and that 200 meters absolutely killed me. I felt I was going to collapse at any second. I think I had to use my ice axe just to stop me collapsing. I was that empty. And then I remember the next thing, I was just hustled into a helicopter. These things normally carry 6 people, but at altitude and of course the thinner air could only carry 2. Now, there was 170 climbers stuck in the Western Cwm, which is quite a lot because it was so early in the season. It was the first rotation, and it was a long operation, but we got down to base camp and obviously came down into chaos, just not knowing really what we were coming back to.
And what was base camp like? Just a war zone?
Yeah, a war zone. A bomb blast would be the best way to describe it. Our home on the mountain, our safe place had just, I say gone. I mean, base camp's a large place, and some teams on the far side had heard the noise, and they heard this big avalanche being released off the mountain on the side, and they'd had a bit of a snow blast, and they just carried on having their lunch as if nothing had happened. But our camp was in the most central area, which had the most direct hit from the Serac fall, and it was just a location roulette, really. Some teams were just ripped apart by rock and snow, and this thing was like a tsunami that had just come down with unbelievable force in the fog. No one had seen it. Nobody could run until the very last minute. And I remember coming into the helipad, and as we kind of moved towards the centre of camp, the damage got worse and worse and worse, and our camp was pretty much unrecognisable. I think of all the teams on the mountain, ours and Adventure Consultants and Jagged Globe, who were next to us, were just the worst. It was unbelievable. You've got everything from shoes to spades to stuff a lot more graphic, really, scattered in every direction. You've got barrels of gear weighing 30 kilos lifted and thrown half a mile by the force of this thing that had come down. People had been thrown hundreds of meters through the air, and our tents are buried under a foot of hard snow and ice and rocks wrapped inside them. The damage was just, we just didn't know where to start. It was horrific, really. And of course, we'd lost 3 of our team, and 22 people had died at base camp. Nobody on the mountain. And base camp is base camp's meant to be the safe place. Base camp's never been hit by an avalanche before, and we just couldn't get our head around it. But we just went into, we went into survival mode. We went into trying to help and trying to salvage and trying to find whatever we could, just trying to do whatever we could to salvage the situation, but not knowing where to start. It was, it didn't sink in till I got home. Until that point, I was too focused on, on kind of surviving, really.
Yeah, it would have been there would have been so much stuff to process. If you guys hadn't have departed to, go up to Camp 1 on that day and had stayed at base camp, it could have been a completely different ending for you.
I'm not a scaremonger. I have no hesitation to say that if we hadn't have gone to Camp 1, if we hadn't have left that morning, I wouldn't be here right now. We saw the way our tents were, we saw the way everything was. We would have been in our tents or we would have been in the mess tent. And like many teams, we would have seen it at the very last moment. We would have either zipped up the tents or got under the table, and the tents were thrown around like paper airplanes. Most of us, if not all of us, would not be here. And it was a miracle that 3 of the biggest teams were on the mountain that day. And they were the ones around ours: Adventure Consultants, Summit Climb, Jagged Globe. Well, there was the Gurkha expedition. The Jagged Globe team lost one of their clients. And if we hadn't have all gone up that day, the death toll would have probably been 3 or 4 times higher, without a doubt. It was a miracle that we were all up there on that time. Most of the deaths had happened straight around ours. The team next to us had lost, I think, about 6 to 7 people. Adventure Consultants lost 5 Sherpas. We lost Pasang Temba, Kumar, and Tenzing. And I knew Pasang Temba and I knew Kumar from the year before. And that hit us the most. They were loved by everybody. And when we saw them chirping away at breakfast that morning and the night before, that was the last time we'd see them alive, and they were doing their jobs they were proud of doing. And that just seems unfair, that, why them, why not us? And it's just, that's been the hardest thing to take.
In that moment that it all happened and it all kicked off and after, when you were still on the mountain, what was it that kept you going? What was it that stopped you from giving up?
Do you mean what, back at base camp? Or?
No, not at base camp. This is before you'd been helicoptered off the mountain.
I mean, you don't really have any choice. You're in a situation, you can deal with it or you can't. And I think having a good team around you is important, but you just know that you've got to force the water down, you've got to get the food down, you've got to care for yourself. Otherwise, you're going to make the situation a damn sight more serious. And, it just naturally happened. You just naturally flip into that, into that mindset. But you see how everybody responds in a different way.
Yeah.
There was, once we got down to base camp, I mean, at that point, it was a case of the Sherpas had lost so much. They'd stayed around to help us. It only felt right that we stayed to help them. And some of the team decided not to play part of that. I mean, to be fair, they had young kids, they had families, they had more responsibility than me, and they went home straight away. But I decided that I had no responsibilities in the same way that I had to stay and help. They got flown out straight away. And, that's their own choices. But with some people on the team, after the first day, they just stopped bothering trying to help. They stopped bothering trying to dig and trying to salvage. They just sat in the tents. And I kind of didn't want to go home feeling like I hadn't done everything I could. And it's obviously, it's a personal situation. It's a demoralizing situation when you're kind of digging around, seeing your stuff just destroyed and scattered everywhere. But you do see how everybody responds in a different way in that environment. And it was pretty heartbreaking, really. Yeah,
it's an incredible story.
Well, it's certainly an experience that, I hope I haven't got to live through it again. And I'm just, I was just really fortunate to have great, to have a great, support around me and, you know, a great team, and obviously very fortunate that I was spared, and I'll never know why I was. I mean, you know, everybody responds differently to these things. I remember walking around base camp, you know, the day after, and to be honest, at first I was too wrecked that I could. It took me probably half an hour to walk just a few hundred meters to camp. You know, every few steps I'd have to sit down, and then once I got some food down me, I was back to normal again. I remember walking around and, you know, finding blood on the rocks and finding a cross and finding people's belongings and photos just torn apart and just lying there. And then I found the body of one of the victims that was still to be flown out, and stuff like that. You know, it really brings things home. It gives you perspective, and you know, it didn't hit me till I got home. It wasn't until I kind of went out of survival mode that it really sank in, and then it started to really, really hit home what I'd been fortunate to come out of when Nepal has just been so badly hit. But the only way I've been able to deal with that is to turn it into something positive, you know, to grow from the experience and to do what I can in terms of fundraising and trying to make sure I pursue my dreams and my passions, because all these people, whether they were workers or climbers, had their hopes and dreams taken away just like that.
Yeah, it sounds like a movie. It sounds like it could be, you know, it could
be the Mr. Bean's Guide to Climbing Everest, probably. You know, I know I've been there and I've been involved in the two biggest Everest disasters in history, and this season I'm seeing friends and people who were there last year. You know, they're having a successful season with no drama. Most of them are reaching the top, or most of them are on the way up there. And part of me is bitter. Part of me thinks, you know, this is unfair. You know, I worked hard. Why not me? But then I think, well, actually, all we can do is grow from these things. It is what it is. Life is unfair. Life owes us nothing. All we can do is keep on going, keep on getting ourselves back on our feet. Otherwise, the biggest obstacle is just going to be ourselves.
It would have been like, even sort of between when you got home to now, I don't think it'd be something that will ever leave you, you know, surviving that experience and living through it and witnessing what you saw.
Yeah, it's one of those things that will live with me for the rest of my life. But I think in a positive way, it's certainly changed my perspective and will help me live my life in the best possible way.
Now, what does the future hold for you? Are you working on anything? Are you planning on anything? Are you planning to go back to that region? Have you sort of got any plans, you know, for the short or medium term that you're working towards or anything like that?
I mean, Everest has become more than just a kind of a gap year goal. It means so much to me, but it's turned into so much better stuff. Like, you know, I'm a motivational speaker. I'm an ambassador for, you know, a few kind of key organizations. I'm a director of a company helping young people achieve their potential. I'm a book and you know, as well, and it's given me all these amazing opportunities and experiences, and I'm really fortunate that I'm able to make a living now from Everest. And, you know, my challenge is really to try and, you know, share my experiences and use that as a positive vehicle to inspire other young people, you know, to overcome adversity. And anybody of any age, really. I really feel that I'm fortunate that I now have, even though I've not reached the summit, I'm able to use these pretty unique experiences actually to reach out to more people, to raise money for charity and to make a difference. So I want to ideally keep on building that. But Everest is a personal thing as well, and I will be going back. At the moment, I'm just focusing on my book, Icefall, which has been endorsed by Bear Grylls himself, which is an honour for me. That's been out for 2 months now. It's sold over 1,000 copies, which I'm really proud of, and it's getting great feedback. So at the moment, I'm just trying to make that a success, trying to get my story back out there. In terms of challenges, nothing major at the moment. As I said, my half marathon tomorrow has cut short due to my laptop on my toe, but I'm back in Himalayas in the autumn to climb Achoayu, which is the 6th highest peak in the world. Yep. So that's my next project. And then after Everest, you'll have to follow the journey and wait and see.
Yeah, no, I definitely will. And whereabouts can we find out more about you, track your future adventures and your progress, and where can people reach out and say hi?
Yeah, no, that'd be great. So I'm, quite active on the social media. My website and my blog is alexstaniforth.com. On there's links to my Facebook and Twitter. My tweets are on at @Alex_Staniforth. Instagram, @Alex_Staniforth_, different order. Facebook.com/AlexAdversity. My book is available through my website as well. And on my site, it's probably the best way for links to all of it and my videos and my blog. But it'd be really great to have people following the journey and just to really show people what happens when they never give up.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show, and I hope it's been inspirational as well.
Oh, it has, definitely. I'll put all those links in the show notes, and a link to your book. And good luck with the future, and thanks for coming on to the podcast. It's an incredible story. If they ever do make it into a movie, who would play you? Who would you pick to play? Who would you hire to play you from Hollywood?
Mr. Bean. Johnny Depp, but he's probably too he's probably too good looking. I don't know, to be honest. I mean, Icefall is it would make a good movie. I mean, of course, the Everest movie that came out recently is something I've not seen yet, but I guess Icefall gets its name from the icefall where the avalanches happened, and just showing how you manage to get back on your feet time and time again when things are fragile. So as for an actor, I'll have to give it some thought, really. But Bean's my choice.
Thanks again for coming on to the podcast, and good luck with everything. And thanks again.
Yeah. Cheers for having me, Matt, and great speaking with you.
Okay, cheers.
Cheers. Thanks.
You've just been listening to the Born to Kick-Ass podcast at borntokickass.com. If you liked what you heard and want more, please subscribe on iTunes. Give a 5-star rating and a kick-ass review. This really helps to boost our presence and continues to allow us to introduce you to the most fascinating people on the planet. Welcome aboard, and catch you next time.